Thank you very much, Ambassador Bissett. Mr. David Orchard will continue.
Well, I knew some people didn't like me, but I didn't realize I was that many. Well, thank you very much, Lily. I'd like to commend the organizers of this event, Lily Petrovich and the others who organized the commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the bombing of Yugoslavia. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Ambassador Bissett and Scott Taylor today. Ambassador Bissett and I were part of the ad hoc committee to stop Canada's participation in the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, along with Marilena Repo, Michael Mandel, David Jacobs, Michelle Chossudovsky, Ursula Franklin, Rosalie Bertel, Rolly Keith, Michael Bliss, and others. And Scott Taylor, of course, spoke out and wrote powerfully at demonstrations and events across the country against the bombing. As was mentioned here, 10 years ago today, the most powerful military alliance in the history of the world began bombing little Yugoslavia, and they did it for 78 days. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, is headed by the United States, as was mentioned. The supreme commander of NATO is always an American general, and it was set up after the Second World War as a defensive alliance. But here it was bombing Yugoslavia, which is a small European country under half the size of my home province, Saskatchewan, an ethnically mixed federal state with originally about 24 million inhabitants. It had been a strong and a staunch ally against both German and Italian fascism during World War II. They lost 1.5 million people in fighting in the forefronts against fascism. And now we were part of an unprovoked attack against our former ally. And in an article that I wrote during the bombing, I called the bombing of Yugoslavia one of the defining moments of the 20th century. It set the stage and provided the model for the invasion of Afghanistan 2 years later, and then the U.S. assault and occupation of Iraq. And it was a stage for an all-out intellectual justification for the overthrow of international law, as Ambassador Bissett has mentioned, and its replacement essentially by the rule of the powerful. The NATO attack on Yugoslavia was illegal on a host of fronts. Even the attacking countries couldn't deny that, so they coined their phrase illegal but legitimate. And they made it clear that they were above international law. Michael Mandel, the professor of international law at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, called the attack by NATO, and I'll quote, "a terrible crime against humanity, a crime against international law and the Charter of the UN, and a crime against history, a crime against the truth." And we have Professor Mandel's articles on the table out at the back, a bunch of material you can pick up. We have Ambassador Bissett's articles that he wrote at the time and a number of others as well. But during the bombing, Professor Mandel and a group of lawyers demanded that NATO leaders be investigated for war crimes, and they submitted a large dossier to the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague and asked them to investigate, which they refused to do. International law and the UN Charter explicitly state that the only justification for lethal force by one country against another is under a case of self-defense, and self-defense is defined quite narrowly as being under direct and ongoing attack yourself, or if it's been authorized by the United Nations Security Council. Neither of those had occurred in the case of Yugoslavia. The Nuremberg Tribunal, which tried Germany's leaders after World War II, ruled that to initiate a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime. And yet this is what Canada and its NATO allies did in Yugoslavia, which had not attacked Canada. Yugoslavia had not threatened any of its neighbors. It had not attacked or threatened any NATO country which was now flying over it, dropping bombs. During that 78-day assault, NATO dropped 23,000 bombs and cruise missiles on a virtually defenseless nation. Over 100 schools and churches were hit. Power stations, oil refineries, factories, and chemical plants were hit, discharging their toxic materials into the air and the water. Trains, train stations, apartment buildings, bridges, some 4,000 were killed and 10,000 wounded, most of them civilians. And because NATO didn't like the media coverage from Belgrade of the war. They bombed the television station in Yugoslavia's capital, incinerating 12 young journalists and burying them under the rubble. And as Ambassador Bissett mentioned, China had opposed the attack at the UN, and their embassy in Belgrade was bombed. NATO used internationally outlawed cluster bombs, and in a fact that received almost no publicity, the United States used missiles containing depleted uranium ammunition. When these missiles, hardened with depleted uranium, vaporize on impact, their deadly DU spreads all over. It's breathed in by the people, and it becomes a deadly radioactive legacy for all eternity. And most of the DU in US weapons is coming from Canada, from my home province of Saskatchewan, which is the largest supplier of uranium to the United States. I wrote an article right during the war, during the bombing. It was published by the Globe and Mail, and they cut out my sentence referring to the use of depleted uranium. I found newspapers across the country would cut out the passages in my articles in which I referred to depleted uranium. I phoned the Globe and Mail. I said, "Why did you cut that sentence out?" They said, "Well, you can't prove it." I said, "The Pentagon themselves have admitted that they're using depleted uranium ammunition. The US A-10 Warthogs use it, the missiles that are being fired from the tanks." But that's the kind of silence that reigns in our country and many around the world about the use of this weaponry that is absolutely inexcusable. And in Canada, as the ambassador mentioned, there was almost a virtual unanimity of support. There was almost a complete lack of political opposition. All the parties in our House of Commons supported the attack, backed by wall-to-wall media coverage. And it was our horror at this complicity and the lack of dissenting voices that led the group of us, as I mentioned, to come together and speak on behalf of all of those who didn't want our country to be part of this action. NATO's own charter had stated it was a defensive organization, so why had it launched this attack on Yugoslavia? And why had the Western media, for 10 years, demonized the Serbian people and their leaders, labeling them essentially as bloodthirsty monsters? This term, humanitarian bombing mission, was coined by NATO and used by Canadian government officials who claimed that NATO was bombing Yugoslavia to stop the Serbs from ethnically cleansing the Albanian population, as has been mentioned by both Scott and Joe Bissett. Yet, as has been pointed out so often, the exodus of people out of Kosovo began after the bombing. It was a result of the bombing. It was people fleeing from our bombs, fleeing for their lives. NATO also actually remarkably stated that it was bombing Yugoslavia to force it to sign the Rambouillet peace agreement. Yet international law states clearly that a treaty obtained by force or the threat of force is void. Among its terms, the Rambouillet Treaty stated that the economy of Kosovo shall, and I quote, shall function in accordance with free market principles and allow the free movement of goods and capital in and out of the country. Yugoslavia had resisted the wholesale push for privatization and globalization. It had a domestically controlled mixed economy with a strong publicly owned sector. It had its own pharmaceutical industry, its own aircraft industry, its own automobile, the Yugo, and it refused to allow US bases on its soil. In fact, during the bombing, of course, the Yugo factory was blown to rubble.